Rachel Matthews spent 5 years feeding, bathing, and comforting her disabled husband, Thomas, only to discover he had secretly regained his strength, was siphoning money into a hidden account, and cheating on her with another woman who believed his wife was dead. In the town of Clearwater Springs, a peaceful suburb nestled among rolling hills and tree-lined streets, Rachel and Thomas Greer were a couple known for their strong bond and quiet devotion. Their love story began in high school, where they met during a school play, Rachel backstage with the costume crew, Thomas playing the lead. From the outside, their lives seemed almost cinematic. They married young, built a modest but warm home, and settled into a rhythm of shared dreams and simple joys. Thomas, with a knack for engines and a fondness for vintage cars, opened a small mechanic shop on the edge of town. Rachel worked at the local library part-time, always coming home with a new book and stories about the regulars who came in just to chat. For years, life was good. There were no children, though they had tried. A few miscarriages had left emotional scars, but they leaned on each other, choosing to see their marriage as enough. They filled their days with hikes in the nearby woods, weekend trips to flea markets, and movie nights curled up on the sofa. Their life was ordinary, but in that ordinariness lay a deep sense of peace. Then, on a wet October afternoon, everything changed. Thomas had gone to pick up a part for a client's car. Rachel remembered that day clearly because they had argued that morning about something silly. Whether they should get a dog. She had said yes, he had said no. When he left the house, he had barely looked at her. She spent the afternoon cleaning, telling herself he'd come back and they'd laugh about it over dinner. But dinner never happened. The call came just after 4 p.m. Thomas had been in an accident. A truck had run a red light at an intersection, just outside town, slamming into the driver's side of his car at high speed. Emergency responders had to cut him out of the wreckage. He had been airlifted to a hospital in the city with multiple fractures, a punctured lung, and severe spinal injuries. Rachel drove to the hospital in a daze, the world around her blurring. Doctors greeted her with grim expressions. Thomas had survived, but barely. He was conscious, but his spine had suffered significant damage. The prognosis was devastating. He would likely never walk again. They couldn't promise he would ever regain full function below the waist. She sat at his bedside, holding his hand through the beeping monitors and sterile hospital smells. His face, battered and pale, barely resembled the man she had kissed goodbye that morning. For weeks, she barely left his side, learning about his condition, his medications, his new needs. When they brought him home 2 months later, their house felt different, colder, quieter, and filled with equipment. Wheelchair ramps, adjustable beds, safety bars. Their old routines vanished overnight. Rachel became more than a wife. She became his nurse, his chauffeur, his cook, and his advocate. She fed him, bathed him, dressed him, and lifted him in and out of bed. She attended endless physical therapy sessions and fought with insurance companies over coverage. She gave up her job at the library and started spending every waking hour attending to his needs. In those early months, she held on to hope. Maybe the doctors were wrong. Maybe he would walk again. She read articles, joined support groups, watched videos of miraculous recoveries. But as the seasons changed and progressed, remained slow, hope began to slip through her fingers like water. Thomas didn't talk much anymore. He stopped joking, stopped asking about her day. He spent hours staring at the television or scrolling through his phone. She couldn't tell if it was the pain, the frustration, or the quiet resentment that had started to take root. Friends stopped visiting. Family checked in less and less. The couple, once known for their community involvement and open-door hospitality, became a ghost of their former selves. Rachel found herself isolated. Her days, filled with routines, her nights with exhaustion. She tried to stay positive, telling herself love meant sacrifice, and this was just part of their journey. She decorated the house for holidays, even though Thomas never seemed to notice. She cooked his favorite meals, even when he barely touched them. She wheeled him outside on sunny days and read to him when his hands were too weak to hold a book. Sometimes she would talk to him as if he were still the same man from years ago. The man who would sneak up behind her in the kitchen and wrap his arms around her waist, whispering jokes into her ear. But now, his responses were mechanical. Short, detached. Still, Rachel held on. She believed in the vows they had taken, in sickness and in health. Her love didn't vanish because of the wheelchair or the silence. She reminded herself daily that he was suffering too, that his anger wasn't about her, but about what he had lost. She learned to carry the weight of 2 lives on her shoulders, telling herself that things would get better with time. Then came the 5th year. Something shifted that year. Not suddenly, but gradually, like a tide pulling back. Thomas began insisting on more independence, using the ramp without her help, managing his medications himself. At first, Rachel saw this as a victory, a sign he was regaining control of his life. She encouraged it, even celebrated the small milestones. But something else came with it. He became more secretive. He spent long hours alone in the study. He changed passwords on devices and locked drawers he had never locked before. He started ordering things online, clothing, accessories, items that didn't match his lifestyle, or limitations. She found receipts for cologne he hadn't worn in years. She dismissed them at first. Maybe he was just trying to feel normal again. But deep inside her, a worry began to bloom. A quiet, unwelcome whisper that something was wrong. Not with his body, but with their relationship. She ignored it. She kept caring for him, even as her own health began to suffer. She rarely slept more than a few hours a night. Her back ached from lifting. Her hands were cracked from cleaning. But she kept going, driven by love, duty, and habit. And then, one day, while cleaning the living room, she found it. A napkin. Light pink, with a faint stain of lipstick across one edge. Tucked between the cushions of his wheelchair. Rachel didn't wear lipstick. She hadn't in years. She stared at it, numb, her breath caught in her throat. It was the first clue, small and almost meaningless on its own. But to her, it felt like a dagger. Something was happening, something she wasn't supposed to find, and this time she wouldn't ignore it. Rachel tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in her chest since finding the lipstick-stained napkin. She told herself it might have been dropped by a visitor, though they rarely had any. Maybe it stuck to the wheelchair from a store, or maybe it was part of the packaging for one of the many items Thomas had begun ordering online. The excuses she made were flimsy, and she knew it. But for a few days, she clung to them. It was easier than facing the possibility that something darker was going on. Still, that nagging sense of doubt refused to fade. She began to observe Thomas more closely, noticing how often he checked his phone, how quickly he would lock the screen when she entered the room. His once predictable habits had changed. He was staying up later, often long after she had gone to bed. The light under the study door would stay on until the early hours of the morning. Sometimes when she brought him tea or a snack, she found him startled, almost guilty, slamming his laptop shut, as though she had caught him doing something shameful. Rachel didn't ask questions, not right away. She wasn't ready. She needed to be sure. But the more she watched, the clearer the pattern became. Thomas had changed, not just in mood or routine, but in demeanor. He had started grooming himself in ways he hadn't since before the accident. He insisted on privacy when changing clothes, even though she had been dressing and bathing him for years. He refused her help with shaving, often locking the bathroom door while he spent nearly an hour getting ready, even if they had no plans to go anywhere. One morning, while sorting laundry, she found a shirt at the bottom of the hamper that wasn't his. It was a women's blouse, light lavender with pearl buttons. It smelled faintly of perfume she didn't recognize. There was no explanation. She hadn't bought it, hadn't worn it, and she couldn't imagine why it was hidden beneath his clothes. Her hands shook as she folded it, her mind racing through possible answers she didn't want to accept. When she confronted Thomas casually, asking if someone had visited while she was out, he brushed her off, saying a home health worker must have dropped something. But they hadn't had a nurse in over a year, and Rachel knew it. The lie was too easy for him, delivered without hesitation. It confirmed what she had feared. Thomas was hiding something. It was around that time that she remembered the online support group he had joined. He often referenced it, saying it helped him stay positive and connected with others who understood his struggles. She had believed him, even encouraged it. She thought maybe it gave him some comfort she couldn't provide. But now, those late-night hours online and the guarded behavior around his devices seemed far more suspicious than therapeutic. Rachel decided she needed to know the truth. She borrowed an old laptop from her neighbor and created a fake profile on the forum Thomas mentioned. She made herself a widowed caregiver looking for advice, curious to see what kind of space it really was. The forum was legitimate, full of people sharing stories about pain, recovery, relationships, and isolation. But as she explored deeper, she noticed some users had side accounts, private messaging threads, flirtatious comments, invitations to video chat. She searched Thomas's screen name, the one he used on most sites, and quickly found him. His profile painted him as single, childless, and emotionally available. He posted photos, some recent, clearly taken without her knowledge. He talked about the accident, but there was no mention of a wife, no trace of Rachel. Instead, he described a life of quiet loneliness, writing posts about how hard it was to find love after a disability. He had built a persona that played on sympathy and charm. Rachel followed the trail and soon found the woman he had been talking to. Her name was Erica. She was a personal trainer in a neighboring town, divorced with 2 teenage kids. Her posts were supportive, encouraging, and flirty. Thomas responded to her with warmth and excitement Rachel hadn't seen in years. They talked about meeting in person, shared songs and photos, and wrote messages that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. At first, Rachel wanted to believe it was only virtual. Maybe Thomas had needed an escape, someone to talk to outside their shared reality. But that illusion shattered when she uncovered photos of them together. Erica had posted a picture of Thomas smiling in a hotel room, dressed in clothes Rachel had never seen. The date on the photo was from a weekend Rachel had gone to visit her sister.
She had left town for just 2 days, hoping a short break might clear her mind. That was when it happened.
While she was gone, he had been with Erica. Worse still, Rachel found ride receipts. He had used a local car service she didn't know about, paid with digital wallets she had never seen. The total amounted to hundreds of dollars spent on travel, over several months. Sometimes Erica had visited him at home, sometimes he had gone to her. He had planned their meetings carefully, scheduling them when Rachel was running errands or grocery shopping. All this time, while she had been measuring out medications and lifting him in and out of bed, Thomas had been building a secret life. A life where he was free from the constraints of illness, where he wasn't a burden, but a man desired and admired. The realization crushed her. It wasn't just about the cheating. It was the betrayal of everything she had given up. 5 years. Of sleepless nights, of physical strain, of emotional exhaustion. She had lost friends, opportunities, and years of her life to care for a man who had chosen lies over loyalty. Yet Rachel didn't react immediately. She needed more than rage. She needed clarity. So she kept watching. She gathered screenshots, collected receipts, and saved emails. The evidence piled up until it became undeniable. Then, in the quiet of her bedroom one night, she looked at the woman in the mirror and saw someone she barely recognized. Not just in appearance, but in spirit. She was tired but not broken, hurt but no longer blind. The truth had come into the light, and now it was only a matter of time before everything changed. Rachel sat alone at the dining table, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. In front of her was a folder, thick with printed emails, screenshots, receipts, and timestamps. Every piece of paper inside it held proof of a life she didn't know her husband had been living. One filled with secrets, lies, and another woman. The days that followed her discoveries were long and hollow. She went about her caregiving duties as if on autopilot, making breakfast, checking his medications, wheeling him to the window for fresh air. But inside, she was preparing for something bigger. She was preparing for the end of the illusion. As she continued digging, the layers of Thomas's deception grew more disturbing. What had started as flirtation in an online forum had blossomed into something far more real. Erica, the woman he had been seeing, wasn't just a fantasy on a screen. She had become an active part of his life. Rachel uncovered detailed messages, outlining their meetings, hotel reservations under fake names, and gift purchases charged to their joint account. Expensive perfume, custom jewelry, even lingerie. The betrayal wasn't limited to emotion or lust. It was financial, it was psychological, and it was deliberate. What stunned Rachel most was discovering the truth about Thomas's physical condition. He had regained some mobility months ago, more than she had ever been told. His physical therapist had made note of it in reports that Rachel had never seen, documents that Thomas had intercepted by changing their mailing preferences to digital delivery under a separate email account. According to those records, Thomas had made enough progress to stand briefly and even take a few steps with assistance. He had chosen to keep that from Rachel. He had been faking the extent of his disability to maintain her around-the-clock care, while simultaneously planning to walk out of her life. Literally. Rachel was paying for his therapy, cooking his meals, bathing him, all while he secretly improved behind her back. He had used her compassion as a mask to hide his schemes. Every smile, every thank you, every moment of weakness she had comforted was a performance. Not just to deceive her, but to buy more time until he could leave for good. She found out he had been applying for disability benefits under false pretenses, continuing to list himself as fully incapacitated even after regaining movement. The legal implications were staggering. Rachel realized that if anyone found out, she could be implicated too, simply for being the one submitting paperwork or signing forms he couldn't fill out himself. His plan had been methodical. Rachel discovered a hidden savings account where he had been funneling money month by month, small enough amounts to avoid suspicion, large enough to add up over time. She traced back transfers made over the course of 2 years, all tucked away under a new identity he had created. He was preparing to start over, a new name, a new city, and a new life with Erica, who was under the impression that Thomas was single and struggling to recover from the loss of his wife in an old accident. That lie broke Rachel's heart in a way nothing else did. He had erased her completely from the version of his story he told to Erica. In that world, Rachel didn't exist. There was no one who had stood by his side through surgeries, sleepless nights, or panic attacks. No one who had given up her career and personal dreams to be his lifeline. He had cast her aside as though she had died years ago, because to him she had, not physically, but in purpose. The final blow came when Rachel stumbled across a message Thomas had drafted but never sent. It was an email addressed to Erica, scheduled for future delivery. In it, he outlined his plan to tell Rachel he had met someone new after years of mourning. He wrote that he felt no guilt because life was short and he had suffered long enough. He even joked about her reaction, claiming she would probably collapse in tears and then bounce back to whatever she did before she became my nurse. Reading those words drained every ounce of warmth Rachel had left for him. She realized then that the man she had loved no longer existed, if he ever had. What remained was someone who had weaponized her love, who had taken her loyalty and turned it into leverage. Still, she said nothing to Thomas. She needed more time, more preparation. She began recording things, backing up data, and consulting, a lawyer in secret. Every morning she smiled and carried on, careful not to give away what she knew. She still pushed his wheelchair, cooked his meals, and asked how he slept. She had learned to become an actress in her own life, mirroring the performance Thomas had mastered years earlier. She also started watching Erica. The woman was active on social media, posting smiling selfies, inspirational quotes, and photos of her kids. She occasionally shared cryptic captions about finally finding someone who understands me. She had no idea what she was caught up in. Rachel didn't blame her, not yet. The real betrayal had come from Thomas, who had manipulated both of them for his own gain. The more Rachel uncovered, the more she saw how deep the deception ran. She felt her love turning to something colder, not quite hate, but something close. A realization that she had wasted years of her life believing in a man who saw her not as a partner, but as a means to an end. Every favor, every sacrifice, every tear she had shed for him had been filed away in his mind as a convenience. In those quiet moments at night, Rachel would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, no longer hoping for answers, but planning her next move. She knew confronting him would be inevitable, but when she did, it wouldn't be with a scream or a cry. It would be with facts, with evidence, and with power. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't the one being taken care of. She was taking back control. And Thomas wouldn't see it coming. He had thought she was weak. He had mistaken her silence for ignorance. But Rachel had been watching. And soon, the truth he had buried so carefully would come crashing down around him. Rachel stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the wheelchair Thomas had used for years. It sat there, silent and empty, a symbol of everything she had sacrificed. She ran her fingers along its handles, remembering the days she had pushed him through parks, into clinics, and around the house they used to share with laughter and trust. Now, all she could feel was the weight of betrayal. The truth had poisoned every memory. Her plan had grown sharper with each passing day. She had waited long enough. After weeks of gathering proof and meeting discreetly with a lawyer, Rachel finally had enough evidence to confront Thomas in a way that couldn't be denied, or deflected. She wasn't just looking for an apology. She wanted accountability. And not just for what he had done to her heart, but for what he had done to her life. It started with a single letter, printed neatly, and left on his desk where he would find it. It wasn't emotional. It was factual, direct, and impossible to ignore. In it, she listed every lie she had uncovered, the secret messages, the hotel visits, the financial deception, the falsified disability records, and the hidden bank account. Each point came with an attached copy of the evidence. She signed it with one sentence. I know everything. Rachel left the house that morning, giving Thomas time to sit with the truth. When she returned hours later, the mood had shifted. The blinds were closed. The air was heavy. Thomas sat in his wheelchair, staring at the letter, his face pale. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He just looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. It wasn't remorse. It was fear. Over the next few days, the silence between them became a battlefield. Rachel didn't yell. She didn't cry. She let the facts speak louder than emotion. Thomas began to unravel. He started asking cautious questions, trying to test what she really knew, hoping there were gaps he could still hide behind. But she had thought of everything. Every excuse he tried, every lie he reached for, she crushed with evidence. There was nowhere left for him to run. She let him know she was filing for divorce. Her lawyer had already begun the process. She had also contacted the authorities regarding his fraudulent disability claims. Rachel had wrestled with that decision more than anything else. It meant exposing not just his lies, but the house of cards her own life had become. But she realized it had to be done. If she stayed quiet, she would still be protecting him. And he didn't deserve that anymore. Thomas panicked. He began pleading, promising it was over with Erica, claiming he had made mistakes and was confused. He said he still loved her, but the words rang hollow. Rachel had watched him lie so convincingly for so long that now the truth itself felt like just another manipulation. She didn't flinch. She didn't soften. She simply told him he would have to face the consequences of the life he had built behind her back. It didn't take long for Erica to find out. Rachel didn't contact her directly. She didn't have to. Once the story began to unravel, it made its way into the open. Thomas had used her too, fed her a story about a lonely man rebuilding his life after tragedy. When she found out, he was still married, living off his wife's sacrifices and committing fraud. The illusion shattered. Erica blocked him immediately. She posted a vague but scathing message online about men who live double lives, and Rachel knew it was meant for him. Thomas's world began to collapse. His fake accounts were reported. His disability claims came under investigation. The money in the hidden bank account was frozen. And most devastating of all, the one person who had stood by him during his darkest days had walked away for good. Rachel, meanwhile, began reclaiming her life. It wasn't easy. She had no job, limited savings, and years of exhaustion weighing on her body and mind. But for the first time in years, she wasn't anchored to someone who saw her love as currency. She enrolled in a caregiver support program that helped her find part-time work. She reconnected with friends she hadn't spoken to in years. Slowly, she began piecing together a new version of herself, one not built around someone else's needs, but her own. People in her life were shocked by the story. Some refused to believe that Thomas, the soft-spoken man in the wheelchair, had been capable of such cruelty. Others had suspected something was off, but hadn't known how to help. Rachel didn't waste energy trying to explain it. She had lived. That was enough. Thomas, now left alone in the home Rachel once filled with care, was forced to face a reality without her. His mobility, though improving, was not enough to live independently without support. The few friends he had drifted away. His reputation was stained by the investigation and the whispers in the community. The very escape he had been planning, a fresh start with a new woman and a new life, had vanished. Rachel never checked in on him. She didn't need to. The chapter was closed. She had spent 5 years pouring everything into someone who had treated her like a convenience. Now she was pouring that energy into herself. There were still sleepless nights and moments of doubt. Healing was never linear. But with each passing day, the pain faded and the peace grew. She sometimes thought about the early days of their relationship, the laughter, the hope, the vows they had exchanged. She knew now that love alone wasn't enough to hold a life together. It needed honesty. It needed respect. And once those were gone, what remained wasn't love. It was control, dependency, betrayal. Rachel had escaped it, not just physically, but emotionally. She had found her way out of a story that was never really hers to begin with. She wasn't the wife behind the curtain anymore. She wasn't the caregiver trying to hold it all together. She was simply Rachel, standing on her own at last and choosing herself. 6 months had passed since Rachel walked away from the life she had once built so carefully around Thomas. The days no longer revolved around medications, appointments, and the quiet labor of loving someone who no longer loved her back. The silence that once haunted her home had become peaceful rather than oppressive. She had discovered something she never thought she would find again: freedom. She had moved into a modest apartment across town, a one-bedroom space filled with sunlight and bookshelves and free of painful memories. There were no ramps, no medical equipment, no reminders of the years she had spent tethered to a man who had buried the truth beneath layers of lies. She filled the walls with photographs from her childhood, flowers from the local market, and handwritten quotes that reminded her of her strength. Her mornings began with walks instead of stress, and her nights ended with music instead of whispered arguments or stifled tears. Word about the scandal surrounding Thomas had spread through their former neighborhood. The investigation into his disability fraud had escalated. Rachel had complied fully with authorities, providing documentation that showed she had unknowingly been used as part of his scheme. Her lawyer ensured she faced no charges, and her clean record remained intact. It was clear that Thomas had isolated her, lied to her, and manipulated her trust to his advantage. That distinction was enough to protect her legally, but the emotional scars ran deeper. Thomas had been ordered to return a significant portion of the money he had received through fraudulent claims. Without Rachel's support, and with Erica, long gone, he found himself with few options. His secret savings account had been drained during the investigation. What remained of his dignity eroded when former friends and acquaintances distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone whose lies had reached national headlines. The media hadn't picked up the story directly, but a few local outlets had covered it with sharp tones and subtle judgment. He had gone from being seen as an unfortunate victim of a tragic accident to someone who had weaponized that sympathy for personal gain. Rachel heard about it all through second-hand conversations and occasional email updates from her lawyer. She didn't look up his name online, didn't ask mutual acquaintances for updates. She had learned not to feed the past with her attention. What mattered now was her future, and she was finally making one of her own. She had started working at a local senior care center, part-time at first, helping elderly patients with companionship visits and light assistance. It was work she understood deeply, but this time it wasn't tangled in obligation or guilt. She was paid for her time, respected for her experience, and appreciated by those she helped. For the first time in years, she felt her efforts were truly seen. In her free time, Rachel began writing. She didn't plan to publish anything, but the process gave her a voice she had long forgotten. She wrote about love and betrayal, care and control, and the blurry line between devotion and sacrifice. Her words poured onto the page with clarity and power, as though a dam had broken inside. She wrote not for closure, but for understanding, of herself, her choices, and the long road that had brought her here. She also made friends, real ones. Women from the caregiver support group she had joined, neighbors from her apartment complex, even a few colleagues from the senior center. They met for coffee, shared their stories, and offered each other comfort without judgment. It was a new experience for Rachel, to speak and be heard without having to explain herself. No one saw her as a background character in someone else's life. She was simply Rachel, and that was enough. One afternoon, she received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was familiar, though unsteady. It was from Thomas. She held it in her hands for a long moment before opening it. Part of her wanted to throw it away unread, but curiosity won. Inside, the letter was short. Thomas wrote that he had lost everything: his relationship, his finances, his reputation. He admitted he had made mistakes, though his tone skirted true accountability. He said he missed her, regretted the pain he had caused, and hoped she could one day forgive him. He ended it with a single request: to talk. Rachel folded the letter neatly and placed it back into the envelope. She didn't cry. She didn't feel anger either. What she felt was distance, a vast emotional space between who she had been then and who she was now. She didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. She had already spoken in the way that mattered most, by leaving. That night, Rachel went for a walk under a sky full of stars. The air was cool, the streets quiet. She passed small shops with glowing windows, couples holding hands, and children riding bicycles in the fading light. Life was simple in those moments, and for once, she didn't feel like an outsider to it. She was part of the world again, not locked in a home with secrets or confined to a role she never asked for. As she walked, she thought about how easily a life could be rewritten, how trust could become a tool for control, and how love, if not nurtured honestly, could turn into a cage. But she also thought about survival, about the strength it took to leave when every part of you had been taught to stay. She had survived something not many people understood, and she had done it without bitterness, without revenge, and without losing herself. The story of Thomas and Rachel would never be one of redemption. It would be remembered as a warning, a reminder that deception can wear many faces, even the ones you sleep beside. But more importantly, it would be remembered as a story of reclamation. A woman who had been buried under years of care and manipulation had risen again, not broken, but reborn. Rachel had once believed that love meant giving everything, even when nothing was returned. Now she understood that true love, of self and of others, meant setting boundaries, choosing honesty and walking away when those lines were crossed. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and that at last was more than enough.